Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. We're glad that you could join us today. Hopefully it'll be an exciting and interesting, informative session for you. First, I'll start by introducing our panelists, each of whom will take you through a few of the highlights of the findings of our nationwide poll that we conducted back in mid-May. The first that you'll hear from is Robert Green, our pollster. Robert is the principal at Pierpont Consulting and Analytics LLC. His clients include the Census 2020 Integrated Communications Campaign, the National Retail Federation, the National Association of Convenience Stores, Major League Baseball, and C-SPAN. His writings on the matter have been published in The Hill and the Wall Street Journal. Also joining us today is Shai Akabis, who is the director of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Economic Policy Project. The next person you'll hear from is Adrian Schwer. Adrian is a fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center and is part of our paid family leave task force. And then finally, you'll hear from Maron Yahadas, who is a policy analyst. Maron is on two different projects here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, both our housing and infrastructure project, as well as our business and technology project. So again, thanks all for joining us. I'll turn things over to Robert, who will give you an overview of the poll and our findings, and then we'll go from there. Rob?
Thank you. The presentation, I'll be going through the key findings, and as we look at our study, discuss the study of expanding economic opportunity, in essence, after COVID-19. The main and most important thing to say about these findings is the bipartisan agreement that we see on policies that support work, that strengthen employment. What we uniquely did in this study that I want to say a little bit about before going into the results is that what we did here that is unusual is we measured household impact of, if you would, corona carnage, the economic damage that has occurred over the last few months. And in a sense, I think that's a useful discussion for understanding what's going on and moves, if you would, beyond what we see simply in unemployment numbers. The magnification of the impact on households is strongly felt among Americans of almost every type and description, but it is particularly unfortunate what has happened in Black and Hispanic communities. Let me go ahead and go to the next slide and just go over, first and foremost, the next slide, please. What you see here, just a moment, let me push my screen. When I said there was strong bipartisan support a few minutes ago, let's just say we meant it. This is the share of voters surveyed. And before I forget, we conducted 1,200 interviews between May 11th and May 17th. So this is very fresh information. And we looked, as I said earlier, in depth at the household impact of what's happened over the last few months. At the end of the survey, we looked at a series of potential policy proposals and changes. The ones that always did best were tied to employment. We looked at all sorts of things, but the ones that always did best were tied to employment and employment benefits. The numbers are striking. Let me begin. There's six of them here, excuse me. The first is modernize or increase the flexibility of the unemployment benefits system. The number of people that thought this would either make a real or useful difference, or they had positive attitudes toward it, was all but consensus. 87% of Republicans, 90% of Democrats, 89% of independents. And for those of you watching, that's the row at the very top. I do want to say something I found personally fascinating about these numbers, many things, but one in particular was that the number of Republicans and the number of Democrats who have in fact been through the unemployment benefit system over the last few months are essentially identical. You're just as likely to have experienced it if you're a Republican as a Democrat. The second thing that we looked at, or rather the second of many things we looked at, but the second, if you would, in terms of strength of support across parties, bipartisan strong, is licensing reform to increase geographic mobility, in essence, to make it easier to practice, if you would, or any number of professions across state lines. Again, very strong numbers: Republicans 84, Democrats 86, Independents 87. These two issues, we saw strong numbers across all of these, but I will have to say that in particular it was essentially almost no difference, no matter how you sort of slice and dice the deck in terms of unemployment benefits and licensing. Portability of retirement accounts also extraordinarily connects really well, particularly at a time like this, where so much unemployment has been affected so very much, as we'll get to in a few slides. Again, across the board, Republican 90% positive views. We saw very strong numbers in this. Policy changes would make a real and useful difference. In particular, which you can think of as the top box, 90% among Republicans on increased portability of 401 Roth IRA retirement accounts, 90%, 88% among Democrats, 90% among independents. Expanded paid family and medical leave with tax incentives. This is something that, and it's something that, in fact, there was during, as one of the stimulus bills. This was added early on, that this would become more common during this period. The keeping and expanding paid and family medical leave, again, is very strong, particularly strong numbers, if you would, with independents and Republicans. That is, again, that 81 all the way to the left among Republicans, 87 among Democrats, 85 among independents. Another that did very well was income-driven student loan repayment. A little bit weaker among Republicans, that's a 76%, but again, majority support, honestly, big majority support. Among Democrats, 88%, and among independents, 83%. And then basically changing how earned income tax credit, moving it from something approaching like an income tax refund to making it a monthly benefit, also very strong support. Look, the one other key thing to note is we did not really see as much support for guaranteed income post-crisis. Many people thought it was not a good idea. I was not surprised myself to see that didn't do well with, if you would, Republicans. But what's really striking in those numbers is that the ideas that are the most important and most popular to voters are the ones that concern employment and employment benefits. Talking about those things connect with voters of every type and description: African Americans, Hispanics, liberals, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, and independents. Next slide, please. The key findings were based on, now picking up again on the methodologies. We conducted 8 focus groups in early March in Dallas and Pittsburgh. The timing ended up being extraordinary because so many things became apparent, even though that was in fact right before the COVID-19 pandemic. We went into lockdown. But in fact, many of these things emerged early on and in the groups. The national survey, as I said earlier, was conducted May 11 to 17. As I've already said, Americans have been affected, really all Americans have been affected in some way by the pandemic and the resulting crisis. But the economic impact has really fallen unevenly across the population. I think a key takeaway, this is the 4th bullet down, is where we say here the vast majority of Americans don't want to return to the pre-crisis status quo. We basically tested 3 ways forward for this country. One would be a return to where we were. One would be, if you would, an update with reforms. And one was, we called it, if you would, big holes. And it was about, in essence, how strongly they felt about, making major changes. Interestingly, what they consider big, the voting public considers big, major, important, will help the people like me in everyday life. It's always the pragmatic solutions tied to employment. That's what I said in the previous slide. It is not actually, if you would, far-reaching overhauls of present systems. So in a sense, the rhetoric is strong and it is positive, but where voters of every type and description meet, is improvements to the unemployment benefit system, which, as I noted, many of them have experienced for the first time in the last 10 weeks. It is portable benefits and expanded family and medical leave and income-driven student repayment. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide, please. These are staggering numbers. As did many of you, we saw unemployment numbers that say 13.5%, 14% on Friday. Some people even strangely thought that was good news. The truth is, the household impact, the reverberations of this thing they move far beyond unemployment. And the unemployment numbers, if they're some of the worst we've seen since the 1930s, what we're seeing in terms of hours reduced, pay cut, lost job, furloughed, unpaid leave, forced to part-time, that's an extraordinary chunk of Americans, 42%. And I think, again, there's the magnification of the impact in coronavirus because of coronavirus and the shutdown is something that is still, interestingly, we haven't seen much on. So far as I know, this is the only study that's actually looked at this in depth. The New York Times did a very good examination of this just a few days ago, in the sense of that you have to look at what could be called expanded unemployment to understand the impact. Look, 34% of working voters say they have applied for unemployment benefits, are in the process of applying right now. And that's just a huge number. Next slide. I think this might be the key slide in some respects in the entire presentation. Look, it's 3 in 5 Latino families have had the following things happen to them, sometimes called extended unemployment. We tend to call it job hurt, just as a short phrase to capture it. It's far greater than just unemployment. Reduced hours, it's furloughs, it's forced part-time, it's unpaid leave, or it's pay cuts. And these are all things since March 10. 3 in 5 Latinos, a majority, 54% of African Americans. That would be the second bar graph as we move to the right. Among all, that's at 42%. That's the color that's shown in green. Less damage, if you would, among white Americans, but extraordinary damage, particularly in Latino and African American communities. Next slide. We're seeing the crisis. One thing, again, and it's the in-depth look that we did on, as I said, not only the conditions of corona carnage, if I can use that phrase. Along the way, we looked at really the everyday terrible decisions people are making right now. And they're bad for Americans of every type and description, but they're extraordinarily bad in the Hispanic and Black households in particular. People are missing payments in terms of rent, mortgage, credit card, and utility. And everybody listening or tuning in at the moment should remember, of course, at the time we did this survey, it was, after some delay in many states, many people were starting to get unemployment. And we had 71% who had already, of all voters, who had gotten their CARES payment, which actually sounds about right, because obviously some people didn't qualify for CARES. Look, this is a country where even the voters, the likely voters, if you've ever seen paycheck to paycheck figures, I'm referring now to that box you see on the left. I've seen very credible numbers in terms of insufficient savings. I'm sure many of you have. But even among likely voters in this country, a fifth of the households say they live paycheck to paycheck. They are not actually included, if you would, in the bar graphs you see here. People are making bad choices. They have no choice but to be making some very tough choices now. And this is at the time when, many people, at least temporarily, could draw on CARES. It is when unemployment has been apparent, has at least been coming online for many of them. Keep going. Next slide, please. Identified sources of household debt. These are credit cards. I won't read every single one of these numbers, but student loans, payday loans. And when it came down to how people used their CARES checks, we saw particularly a majority, this is a circle bit, a majority of African American households, voter households in this country, have had to use it for food and groceries. This is These are already, if you would, lifeline payments. Among Latino households, 47% of likely voters, and among whites, a big number, but not obviously as big at 31%. Next slide, please. Younger households and those led by single parents experience more hardship. When you talk about job hurt, which was where we were a few minutes ago when I said it was far bigger than unemployment, and we outlined all the various ways and all the things that have happened just since March 10, it's important to remember that usually the very first people damaged and harmed are, for instance, single-parent households. This is the bar graph you see at the bottom. Fully 59% of single parents who were working before the crisis said they applied for unemployment and or are in the process of doing so. So, in other words, that's a 3 in 5 majority of people who were single parents, which is, of course, a very large category of Americans. People under 45, and you see a particular damage as well, just over 40% of households. What we're seeing, again, is not just damage far greater than unemployment statistics typically suggest. We're seeing it in particular for so many people who were in situations such as single-parent household. Next slide. Let's talk about these changes. Good. This is what I was talking about earlier, and which is that one thing that we did, so imagine that we did in our study something that had not, so far as we know, is unique, and that is an in-depth understanding of just how great the problems, the economic carnage is at this point, and how many ways it can affect people and how they are making tough choices in terms of their everyday lives, bills not paid, money going straight to grocery, so on and so forth, because that's the only way they can possibly do it. So we also looked at, if you would, 3 different, if you would, where do we go from here? And if you would, the blue one and the smallest one is return to status quo. We, in essence, read them several sentences, in essence saying, can we get back to sort of the high employment situation we had before? Return government to the role that it had before, just kind of go back and, if you would, be where we were on or about March 10. That did least well. Update and improve protections. In other words, that this was a period to understand that COVID-19 and what has happened because of the economic damage as part of the necessary healthcare shutdown. Update and improve protections. While more, if you would, more people landed on that than return to status quo. What was really connecting for people, and I tend to think of these when I look at this pie graph, I really think of the 76%, and that would be the 30% to the left in green, and below, essentially in red, is the one that they recognize and they know we need to address big holes in our social protection. Again, as I told you earlier, many voters who had only a passing acquaintance with their social protections have now seen them in operation and found them wanting. And so that's why we see what we see in terms of that 46%. Next. There's bipartisan support for real jobs, not empty promises. These are strong. These are programs that do well and connect, I think, make sense in the politics, if you would, that they are things that I think really connect for people across parties. They really, more than anything else, they want to build savings. They want to, that's greater portability of retirement benefits, which is another way of saying that it's really hard now for people who have multiple jobs or move rapidly from job to job to gain the benefit. Retirement benefits from the first job they might take in their early 20s and all the way through. They want help building, in particular, retirement savings. Second point, modernizing the unemployment and benefit system, the insurance system, and making it more flexible. There are many flaws in the system. Again, this is something that there's been so much attention correctly on all the problems with it. I think this is among the first, if you would, situations where somebody's looked at, at least thinking about how popular it might be to do something different going forward. What they want is a 21st century program, one that permanently includes furloughed workers, independent contractors, and freelancers. They also want to expand and modify earned income tax credit, age eligibility, higher income phase out, permanent expansion of paid family and medical leave, even a modest paid family and medical leave, say 2 weeks, very popular. And finally, student loan repayment, tying it to income, is also highly supported.
All right, thanks, Rob. Thanks for the overview of the slides. We'll turn it over to Shai to pull out some of the details, if you will.
Sure, thanks, Dave. And I think Rob gave a great overview of a lot of the results that we see in this poll. I'm going to run through a few of the takeaways and turn it over to my colleagues to talk a little bit more detail about some of the points that we see. The biggest takeaway, I think, is that we're still in the midst of a severe economic downturn. This survey was taken contemporaneous to the last jobs report that came out last Friday, so it can really be interpreted as adding a lot of color to what is really just a data point with some additional data points behind it in terms of the employment situation in the country. What we see in this poll is a lot more detail about how households are experiencing the current economic downturn. Anyone who thought last Friday's jobs report means that we're out of the woods is sorely mistaken. I think that's really what we see from these numbers. There's tens of millions of households who have effectively gotten an uppercut to the chin as a result of the fallout from the coronavirus, and that's not going away anytime soon. A couple examples from the data beyond what Rob talked about. So about a third of the households that we surveyed said that they were experiencing either some or great financial hardship as a result of the COVID-19 and its effects. And one of Rob's slides showed this, but I think it's important to note that a lot of seniors are buffered from the effects because they rely disproportionately on Social Security and other savings that are not connected to employment. When we look at those households that are under the age of 45, we see that 45% of them say that they are either experiencing great or some economic hardship. And little, I should note, was a choice here too. So some is more than a little. And these are households that say they are really feeling the pain. Also, one other result that I found particularly notable is that 80% of those who were employed part-time before the crisis have either lost their job or had their pay reduced through lost hours or pay cuts. That's pretty astounding. 80%, 4 out of 5 of those part-time workers are experiencing some type of upheaval. All of this evidence really speaks to the fact that the federal government needs to do more. We can't cut what's really an embryonic recovery at best off at its knees. We need to keep federal support in place until a more robust recovery is well on its way. Another point of evidence to this is that public sector workers have not been spared. What we see in our data and what the jobs report showed last Friday is that we're already starting to see the negative effects in that portion of the workforce as well. As of mid-May, 19% of those workers said that they had applied for unemployment insurance benefits. That's only going to continue, and what we learned from the Great Recession of the decade before last is that if we do not provide sufficient support to state and local governments at the beginning of the crisis and into the recovery, it can really prolong the downturn. We heard from Fed Chairman Jerome Powell yesterday that, I should note he was a former visiting scholar at the Bipartisan Policy Center many years ago, and I had the privilege of working with him. But we heard from him in a quote, he said, "Of course, if there were more fiscal support, you would see better results sooner." And then he finished with, "But that's a question for Congress." I agree that it is a question for Congress. I think he has weighed in about as clearly as any Fed chair has or can on this issue. And it's clear from him and many others that this support is sorely needed. Secretary Mnuchin has made that clear as well. That's the first point, is that we are still in this downturn and it is widespread. The second point, which I'm just going to touch on very briefly and then turn it over to my colleague, Meron Yohannes, to dig into a little bit more, is that I think by far the most important, deeper takeaway from this survey that Rob touched on as well is the disparate impact that we're seeing on communities of color. The one thing I want to say on this before Meron digs into the data a little bit is that as economists and analysts, I think we really need to be humble about the reality that we're seeing. We can clearly note and evaluate the outcomes that show up in the data, as this survey does, and lots of our other work at BPC does. But what we're much less well equipped to determine is the specific causes behind that and the struggles that we see. Obviously, some of it has to do with the systemic racism that we have in the society, but how we get at that and approach it with policy solutions, I think, is really critical. And to do that, we need to, as economists and analysts, rely more on the firsthand accounts of people who are experiencing this and what they see as their day-to-day struggles, and helping us identify ways that we can help those communities. So with that, let me turn it over to Maron to talk a little bit more about what we see in that data.
Thank you, Shai. Thank you, Robert. So I want to emphasize two major themes that have come out of this survey. The first being that the data confirms what we already knew about Black and Hispanic households being disproportionately impacted due to discriminatory policies and systemic inequalities in place prior to COVID-19. So these disparities have been very clear for many years, and both sides of the political aisle have not done enough to address them. So for me, in the housing policy perspective, the three most critical findings from the poll are the disproportionate loss of jobs and income, as the poll shows that 45% of Blacks and 49% of Hispanics report unemployment and reduction of work hours in their households, and much higher rates than white households at 27%. The next being the use of limited emergency savings, as 70% of Black households and 60% of Hispanic households that had emergency savings, so I want to emphasize that had emergency savings before the crisis, say that they have dipped into some during the past few months, compared to only 34% of those white households that had savings. Third and last point that was astonishing to me was the rate of missed bill payments. So only 17% of white households say that they've missed a payment, whether that be credit card, utilities, internet, rent, mortgage, whatever it may be, since the start of the crisis, compared to 37% of Black households and 42% of Hispanic households. So before I turn it back to Shai, I want to go into my second theme of what I've seen from the polling data, which is that American families have been incredibly resilient so far. But the polling data shows how highly vulnerable people of color are. These disparities need to guide us into developing policy interventions that will address all Americans during this economic and public health crisis. If hardships continue and government assistance is cut off too quickly, this could lead to further deepening inequalities, as people of color could face even higher risks of homelessness, evictions, illness, poverty, and so much more. So yes, Americans do not want to go back to the way things were, but we also need to be cognizant moving forward. Racial disparities and inequalities must be addressed at the policymaking table. Racial justice must be a priority when developing policy solutions. Thank you all, and I'll turn it back to Shai.
Thanks, Maron. I think what Maron is touching on, and to pick up on that, this crisis, I think, in my opinion, has given many Americans a firsthand experience with the social safety net, as Rob was talking about. 42% of all households facing some type of employment disruption. 30% of all workers saying that they've applied for unemployment insurance. Remarkable. Almost every person across the country has someone in their family or a friend or many of one of those categories who's been impacted. So a lot of people who had never had occasion to find themselves closely acquainted with government programs like unemployment insurance and others before are now having that experience. Those experiences before the crisis were certainly disproportionately had by communities of color who fall into the categories that those programs are intended for. And I think that now that more Americans are seeing the challenges that those programs face and the shortcomings, frankly, that we know they have, it's creating a sense of urgency to fix those programs. One example of this that Rob commented on was unemployment insurance. Only 34% of those who are in the survey that said they are applying for unemployment insurance, or have applied, said that it was very easy for them to do that. That seems like a problem. And an even bigger problem is that 6% of all the workers surveyed, not of those who applied, all the workers surveyed, said that they didn't apply for unemployment insurance specifically because it was too difficult to do so. There were other reasons they could have said they didn't apply as well, but this 6% said that they have not applied because of this reason. That's why we see that only 24% are looking for the federal government to return to effectively the status quo before the crisis. The vast majority are looking for change, and we see bipartisan changes, as Rob pointed out, and we can go into more of those as we go into the rest of the session today. For a little bit of that, I want to turn it over to my colleague Adrian Schweer, who's going to talk specifically about paid family and medical leave here.
Thanks, Shai. It's so great to be with all of you. I thought I'd just take a second. One of the big surprises to us as we tested so many different potential policy solutions to the COVID crisis was that paid family and medical leave really popped up in the top 4 of solutions that workers and voters really want. And for a lot of people, it seems like a newer issue and something that we're just starting to talk about, but it's really 2 issues, and they're right at the forefront of the COVID response. So there's paid sick days and paid family leave, and some shocking realities on paid sick days. A huge portion of America's workforce don't have a single paid sick day. And in states where paid sick days are mandated, you see a statistically significant change in flu cases annually, because sick people that are afraid to miss that work don't go in if they know that they can still get those resources by taking that sick day to care for themselves. And if we have ever in our history seen a moment in time when people who might be sick should be staying home and should feel safe and care like they can stay home, it is now. But important to note that 69% of our low-wage workers in America do not have a paid sick day, not one. And 40% of workers in the service sector do not have a paid sick day. So luckily, in the Families First legislation, Congress really saw this problem, both for paid sick days and for families who had caregiving responsibilities with children out of school or child care institutions that weren't open. They created a new paid leave program that provides tax credits, dollar for dollar, 100% to employers, with a cap, of course, for their workers to be able to take 10 days of paid sick leave if they have a qualified COVID need, and up to 10 weeks of paid family leave if they have a child who is out of school or out of care. And as this data showed, that is really important because 1/3 of children live in single parent households, and single parent households are really struggling right now to choose between caring for this young, vulnerable child and going back to work, especially in tough conditions. So it is really exciting and interesting to see these policies pop in American needs and a desire for a permanent paid leave solution for our country and for our workers. But the one thing I'd flag is there's a lot more to do. So Congress really only protected the paid sick leave and paid family leave for employees who work for companies with 500 employees or less. And if you have 50 employees or less, you can opt out, as well as a lot of the healthcare sector and government workers. So we estimate that about 25% of American workers are currently covered with this temporary paid sick and paid family leave policy, but the vast majority do not have access. And as we're reopening the economy and workers are being called back to work and potentially going off unemployment insurance, going back in their employer payrolls, they're going to struggle between these tough decisions between their caregiving responsibilities and whether or not they go into work when they may have COVID symptoms for fear of missing a paycheck.
Great. First, thanks to Rob Green and to all my VPC colleagues for pulling out the highlights of the polling data. Now we get to the fun part, which is questions. And we'll try to bundle a few. Shai, since you're our resident economic policy director, I'll start with you, and then you can deflect to Marone and to Adrian as needed. Especially as it comes to, and again, I'm going to combine some of the questions asking about what kind of pragmatic solutions do we see are needed to pull the country out of this recession, and what are some of the systemic changes that we could see, both to address the recession itself, but also to address the racial inequities that we've seen in the polling data.
Sure. Well, that's a broad, heavy question. I'll take a stab at a few elements, and then certainly having Marone and Adrian weigh in would be helpful. One area that we do a lot of work on is higher education on the Economic Policy Project at BPC. And I think a really important example of a pragmatic policy solution that has been discussed for some time now, and I think is ready to be implemented, is something called automatically enrolling student loan borrowers into income-driven repayment plans. What I mean by this is that if you are on a standard repayment plan for your student debt, you pay payments over so that you pay it off over 10 years. There exist income-driven repayment plans where people can only pay what is deemed to be an affordable portion of their income. But it's difficult to get on these plans and stay on these plans and work with your student loan servicer to do this. So a lot of people don't make it onto these plans and then end up in real financial trouble and defaulting. What we have right now is a situation where there's a freeze on many student loan payments through September. When that freeze expires, it's pretty clear that this damage that we're seeing economically is not going to be over. We should have a policy that everybody coming off of that, all the student borrowers, are automatically enrolled into one of these plans so that if they don't have any income, then they won't be making a student loan payment. There's no reason to require people who have no income and no ability to pay those payments to make the payments. If they have income, then they do make the payments. That's how these plans work. So that's a policy that we tested here, and we saw overwhelming bipartisan support for that. There's a lot of other examples I could give, but let me turn it over to Meron and Adrian to weigh in on that as well, and maybe I'll conclude with another example after they go.
Yeah, I can go next. Thanks, Sean. In the housing perspective, one thing that BPC has recommended before, which I know would be ideal with the current situation that's going on, is being able to meet the health and housing needs, especially for those who are most vulnerable or experiencing homelessness. So a couple years ago, BPC's Housing Commission had recommended making housing vouchers available to those extremely low-income households. So that would mean incomes at below or 30% the area median income. So ensuring that the folks that needed the most would have access and would be able to avoid homelessness or eviction. So that's one thing that we have discussed in the past, and we're continuing on revamping and working on as we speak.
Adrian, do you want to jump in?
I think Meron did it really well, but I'm going to challenge both my colleagues to roll their R's because she has a beautiful name, Meron.
I would just add that on the income-driven repayment part, I think one point I didn't get to in my answer is that we know that the student debt challenge, and we see this in the poll results too, is disproportionately borne by Black households, and especially low-income Black households. And so this policy reform would be one that would most directly help that community. Another example, I think, is work that we're doing with Bipartisan Policy Center right now. I'm thinking about the tax credits that go to low and moderate income Americans. Again, this is a policy that would help all low and moderate income Americans, but we know that households of color are disproportionately in those groups, and making sure that they are earning an income that makes it affordable for them to have a lifestyle that is above the poverty line and able to put food on the table and pay all of their bills. I think that's an issue that is incredibly important right now. Those tax credits have been in place for many years. The reform to them doesn't need to be specifically a response to the coronavirus pandemic, but it's something that this pandemic is highlighting even more as those households are having trouble making ends meet. And we need to think about real reform that can boost the incomes in those populations. So those are just a few examples of policies that BPC is working on that can help these communities, low-income communities, communities of color, and all Americans that are struggling right now.
Thanks, Shai, and all. I'm going to bring this one back to Rob Green, a question of my own, and then I'll circle back to some of the viewer questions we've gotten. Rob, you touched a little bit on it in your presentation. First, we conducted some focus groups that happened to occur in early March, really before the COVID-19 restrictions started to take place. So we got a view from focus groups of what people were seeing and feeling at that point. And then as we talked about, the survey itself went out in May as the full effects of COVID and the economic carnage were hitting households. So would you talk a little bit about sort of the differences and the similarities that we saw from the focus groups in early March to the polling in mid-May?
The terrible problems with savings, living paycheck to paycheck, really popped. I mean, the difference is in early March, people were still able to paper it over. And what Shai's touched on and everyone Marone, Adrian, and to some degree some things I said earlier. It's just they can't paper it over easily now. But it was there, and it really leapt out. And those groups were interesting in this. It was literally hours before the Corona crisis. So in a strange way, it was a very we know now. It actually sheds light on what we know now out of this, out of what we learned out of the poll. In the sense of particularly why we saw the interest in the portability, doing something about 401, helping people. The hardest one for so many is the retirement, and if they felt that there was a policies that made it easier, in essence, through work, to have their retirement savings covered. They would have that much more to devote, if you would, to rainy day savings. And savings is really basically what they need most now, and what a lot of people don't have.
Great.
Hey, Dave,
Thanks,
I can jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Shai. Did you want to pick up on the savings point? And then I've got another one for you. So think of that one first, or go to that one first. And the next one is another viewer question about with Black and Hispanic households reporting having to tap into their savings, the ones that did have savings, having to tap into it to get through this economic crisis. What steps can we take to fix the social net so that people, again, aren't forced to dip into their savings for emergencies like we're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this all ties in together. And actually at BPC, we have a campaign that we've been running for a couple of years now called Funding Our Future, which is a coalition of about 40 some odd organizations across the private sector and nonprofit sectors focused on this issue of retirement security, but really financial security and savings for all Americans. So this gets back very much to the work that we are doing. You can check that out at fundingourfuture.us. But to get to a little bit more of the statistics of the problem and then some of the solutions, Rob highlighted it well, but when we look at retirement, we see in this poll that, again, the racial disparity here, that 60% roughly of the likely voter households that are either white or Hispanic say that they have an IRA or 401k, those who are working age, but only 48% of Black households have that. And that's really an area that BPC has been invested in trying to expand access to 401ks to especially lower income workers who disproportionately do not have access to them. And then, as we see here, overlapping with communities of color, and especially the Black households. We also see issues in terms of emergency savings that Rob highlighted. I mean, only 62% of American households said that they had money set aside for unexpected situations before the crisis. That's alarming if more than a third of the population has no emergency savings set aside, and only 54% of Black households said that. So almost half of Black households said that they had no savings to tap into if they experienced an emergency. So what we need to think about here are ways that we can not only boost income, which is some of what I talked about before in terms of the tax credits, and how we can boost earned income from employers across the country, but also how we make it easier to save. So if we could have programs at employers where employees are automatically enrolled into an account that they can obviously choose to opt out of if they can't afford it or have other priorities or already have savings, but where employers could automatically enroll their employees to save 1%, 2%, 3% of their salary on a regular basis, and the employer could match it if they chose to. That, I think, would be critical for these millions and millions of households who right now don't have any short-term savings.
All right, Shai, I'm going to come back to you with a Facebook question that we got from Matthew Alexander Haas asking about why there is no requirement that retirement accounts have CRA-like tests to reinvest in the communities where the depositors are living.
Interesting. Not a policy issue that we have directly confronted at BPC, but I think the investment one in disadvantaged communities of color, is critically important for policymakers to be thinking about right now. Whether or not that's tied to retirement accounts specifically, I think is a narrow policy question, but more broadly, things like opportunity zones, and I know that there's been some on the pro side and some on the con side in terms of how well those are working out right now. But I think the intent was incredibly important, making sure that we get investments in these disadvantaged communities that are lacking the resources to help pull themselves out of what is often a really depressed economy on a ongoing basis, not even tied to the economic situation that we're facing right now. That is incredibly important for policymakers to continue working on, whether it's in the context specifically of the Opportunity Zone program to make sure that that is effectively achieving its goals, or other ways that we can put resources into those communities. Without putting her on the spot, Marone, I don't know if there's anything in terms of the housing side of things that this plays into, if you want to comment on.
Yeah, I would want to address that. One of the data points that we found in the survey said that 51% of Black households and 40% of Hispanic households said that they use their CARES check to purchase groceries, whereas only 31% for white households did as well. And I want to emphasize that one thing that has been helpful from the CARES Act was, that check that everyone got. And I think for me, what is critical to really address moving forward is prioritizing emergency assistance, not just rental assistance, but overall assistance that can be used in a flexible way and is targeted to those who need it the most. So if we, one example is, people are struggling to decide whether they pay for rent or whether to pay for groceries, right? As I said in the earlier survey data. And, it shouldn't have to lead to folks having to decide between food and housing, right? And, having the government be able to come in and say, okay, times are tough, but you don't have to decide between either or is going to be crucial to helping Americans further moving forward with this crisis. And emergency assistance has to be allocated quickly. It cannot take a couple of months. Families do not have a couple of months to wait whether they're going to pay for rent or buy groceries. So I feel like moving forward as a housing team at BBC is, looking at policy interventions and solutions, we have to consider assistance programs that are going to be flexible, that are going to address utility payments and rent, food and groceries. It can't just be super specific and neat because families have a ton of things that they pay for and use to survive every day.
All right, so I'm going to ask each of my BBC colleagues. This is almost a softball question because it gets to the point of what can Congress do. I mean, again, what BBC is all about is trying to find actionable solutions to get to make advancements. And so the question is, what are the types of things that Congress can do to solve some of these issues that we discussed?
I'll jump in first,
Adrian,
if that's all right, Dave. I think the other thing that I think I'd love to pair with this is Blake on Twitter asked a question about what will economic recovery look like. And I think there are a couple of things really important from this data to be thinking about that we haven't highlighted in Parity yet. But both Robert and Shai really talked about how that age 45 and below has been hit pretty hard in this environment. And when you look at prime working age workers across the country, 40% of them have children in the home. And with those single parent household challenges, as the economy starts to reopen and people start to go back to work, which they want to do, there's a very good chance they were already struggling to find quality childcare, quality affordable childcare. And it's even harder now. And it is going to be really hard for working parents to re-enter the economy and regain some of these basic norms that bring them to be able to purchase the food and pay for their rent and recover from this crisis. And I think we need policies that intertwine with the workplace that will help them over the next year balance the needs of family and work so that they stay connected to the workforce and stay gaining savings, gaining retirement savings, really participating in this economy. And we have a really big challenge ahead of us for those young families. So things like paid family leave, paid sick days, affordable childcare. Congress has made really amazing bipartisan strides over the last year in both of those places, and they can double down. They can cover more workers with paid leave so that when people are sick, they are staying home, protecting their communities, protecting their colleagues, and protecting their families. And people who have caregiving responsibilities, may they be children as currently covered or caring for an aging adult, they need to have paid basic protections and paid family leave to get us through this crisis and have the most bounding economy in the months to come. And I think Congress has proven that they can come together on these issues. We've really seen Speaker Pelosi and the president come together on issues of paid sick days and paid family leave over the last year, and I think they can do it again.
Yeah, I totally agree, Adrian. I think we've seen that in the savings and retirement space as well. Recently, they passed the Secure Act late last year, which was in the works for about a decade, but it did get over the finish line on an overwhelmingly bipartisan basis. There's more work that needs to be done clearly in the savings and retirement space, but I think that was a good example of work that can come later. And then when we're thinking about immediate relief efforts this summer, there's a couple things that clearly need to be on the table right away for policymakers as they try to provide further relief and stabilize the economy and help it to recovery. Things like aid to state and local governments. It's been talked about a lot in recent months, but disproportionately, communities of color are employed in public service positions, I believe, and that would be even more detrimental if we were to see massive layoffs at state and local government levels. So I think figuring out what the right amount of support is will be a challenge and goes into the details, but that needs to be on the agenda, as well as making sure that unemployment benefits do not immediately drop back down the $600 that they've been expanded at the end of July. There's definitely a robust conversation that needs to be had about what the structure of that additional benefit should be that is conducive to an economic recovery to make sure that we have the incentives properly aligned for people who do have the opportunity to return to work to do so. But the idea that we can just immediately let households that are relying right now on these benefits for their livelihood go back to a replacement rate with regular unemployment insurance that usually replaces somewhere between a third and half of their prior income for a prolonged basis when many of these families aren't going to be able to go back to work. I think that would be seriously detrimental to not only those families, but also the economic recovery.
Adam, anything you'd like to add from your viewpoint on what Congress might be able to do?
Yeah, I want to echo Shai and Adrian again. I mean, we've seen with the CARES Act, specifically when it comes to housing, how HUD has provided grant waivers and guidances that's helped, homeless shelters and local public housing agencies better be flexible in assisting low-income families. So again, continuing what I was saying earlier, it's going to be important to quickly allocate any targeted funding, any new funding that will possibly come if there's the next stimulus package. And it needs to be quickly allocated, and it needs to be targeted to the people that actually need the funding, those that are low income and communities of color that are disproportionately affected. We need to continue the regulatory flexibilities that Congress had given in the CARES Act, as well as the Trump administration in Department of HUD, HHS. That needs to continue because that has been helpful. And moving forward, as I said, being flexible. The funding that is allocated should not just be niche. It should not just focus on one particular aspect. As families have many things that they pay for, they have many stresses and other bills that they have to pay and cannot get forgiven or cannot be paused. We need to take that into consideration as well.
Great, thanks. All right, Rob, as the pollster, tell us how unusual or normal. Again, I'll leave it to you to describe it, but it seemed like in that first chart that you showed during your presentation about just overwhelming agreement, not just majority support for a number of these policy solutions, but near equal support across Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. How did you find that?
I did find that unusual. And look, we've touched on it already, but think of it this way. I think a great deal of this has to do with people finding out things weren't. They had many people, not necessarily everyone, and not necessarily many of the people that are suffering the most now, but many people had never, or it had been many years, many people had never, or it had been many years since they had had any experience with our social protections, and they were found wanting. And I think the fact that we looked in depth so much, this was an economic study of, if you would, voters, the economic what's happened and how it's affected household incomes, household economic circumstances, and we did it very much in depth, and you've heard a lot of that over this last 50-odd minutes. And that experience is really deep in a way that is different from everyday partisan politics, who's for what and who isn't, who you align with politically or not. The fundamental nature of what happened is what makes, I believe, it is what's driving what you're seeing in so much support. I'm very struck by how many of these ideas make a great deal of sense philosophically, granted in somewhat different ways, but philosophically in both the parties. And I believe there's so many stories of improvements in the social protections that would connect to people that are normally, hesitant to change very much in that area. So, and I would attribute to circumstances none of us wanted, most of all the people that are the most affected, but it has changed our viewpoint on these things. And that is something that undeniably we were able to do because of this strange time in which we live.
Okay, thanks, Rob, for that. And so I'm going to pick up on that and then kick it over to Shai as we come down to about 4 minutes left. As alluded to earlier, before the focus groups, before the survey was out in the field, across the country we were at historic lows in unemployment amongst all communities. Even in Black and Hispanic communities, we're seeing historically low numbers of unemployment. So as you alluded to, there were people that had not had the need to interact with the unemployment system. And then that all changed in the last couple of months. So Shai, do you want to talk about how, again, the systems that we have in place during sort of boom times are exposed by this kind of a crisis and show the holes that might exist that need to be filled?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I mean, I think you put it well, which is all this crisis has done is elevated and highlighted what these programs' challenges are even in normal times. It's really just lifted it up in front of all Americans' eyes, and in fact, many Americans who are trying to get access to these benefits that they sorely need. What I think will be important to see is whether we get policy action out of this in the coming months. I don't expect that all of these challenges are going to be addressed in the next legislation combating the economic effects from the coronavirus, but over the next year, 2 years, 3 years, do we get meaningful reforms of some of these programs that people now realize are falling short? And I think, Dave, another issue to highlight that you hit on is we were seeing in that boom of the past decade or so, we really had a decade straight of economic growth, benefits to communities of color that we hadn't seen in many prior expansions. I think because it went on so long and it was robust, even though the economy wasn't growing at a ridiculous pace, it was growing steadily and for that period of time. And so it brought a lot of people, workers who have trouble normally finding employment off of the sidelines and brought them into the labor force in a way that they hadn't been before. And what we can't allow is for this setback to have long-term or permanent effects that counteract everything that we just accomplished over the past decade. I think it's safe to say it's going to have some deleterious effect because I don't expect that this recovery is going to be a V-shaped one. We got a little bit of a bounce back we saw in the last jobs report, but there's a long, long way to go, and I think it's going to be a lengthy tail of a recovery. But the more that we can do from a federal policy level to prevent those permanent dislocations in employment, the permanent businesses that are going bankrupt and out of business, the more that we can do to avoid those outcomes, the better, because those outcomes are irreversible.
So Shai, I'm going to stick with you. We've got about a minute left, and I'll give you one more question from one of our viewers. Dan Martinez from YouTube asks, along the lines of what you were just talking about, what has happened with the National Task Force on Reopening? Are you aware of any progress or actions that they've started to take?
I am not. It seems like this is very much occurring at a state level, and so different states are moving at different paces, which is to be expected because the virus is developing very differently in different states and regions of the country. What is concerning from a policy standpoint is a couple things. First, if we don't find a vaccine or a seriously effective cure in the relatively near future, there is going to be a reduction in demand that is not just over the course of a couple months, but perhaps over the course of a year or more. And how the economy responds to that is going to be very telling. We've seen this immediate drop in the past couple months in employment from just the shutdown. There was a proactive attempt from the government to have everybody stay home. But now that the economy is reopening and people are returning to work in many places, how much of that drop in demand actually has second order effects where businesses like retail and others, travel, that expected to bounce back quicker can't do so because there isn't the consumer confidence and the consumer spending and the demand that it takes to keep those businesses running. Restaurants is another good example. If you have half the demand in a restaurant, you need half the staff, and some of those layoffs become permanent that weren't expected to. So I think how that evolves in the next couple months is going to be really important. And the worst case scenario would be if we have to return to a widespread lockdown where we have several additional months, certainly weeks, months of basically economic stasis, because that will not only have the direct economic effect, but the effect on confidence and the ability to bounce back from this crisis.
All right. Thank you all. Again, we are out of time, so I thank Robert Green and all my Bipartisan Policy Center colleagues for participating. I thank all of those who have tuned in on the various channels. You can find the underlying data and some of the results on our website, bipartisanpolicy.org. Check it out. Keep us in mind on Twitter and YouTube and Facebook, and look for our stuff. And we'll look forward to talking to you for our next webinar. Thanks, everybody.